I'm not a good person. Plain and ugly as that sounds, I say it first, because it makes everything that follows easier to hear. Confession is an odd thing, cleansing only in stories, not in the dark. I learned that the hard way. I did things for money, for the rush, for power in tiny, rotten doses. I never called myself a monster. I told myself I was practical. I told myself I had rules. Those rules held up until they didn't. What I'm about to tell you are true things that happened to me. They're ugly, they're uncomfortable. They're from my side, the side most people try to avoid listening to. You won't get a moral lecture. You won't get a neat lesson learned tied with a bow. You will get the small, slow decay of someone who thought he could take without consequence. And sometimes consequence doesn't come how you expect. If this kind of raw, unfiltered, dark true story is your thing, consider subscribing. There are more like this. Stay with me. These are 4 separate nights, 4 different kinds of wrong. I survived them. I wasn't always the one walking away. Story 1. The Elderly Con. The little towns on the map are the kind you pass through without thinking. One blinking light, a grocery that smells like cinnamon and detergent, a bank whose clock always runs 10 minutes slow. People leave doors unlocked there because they trust the kind of people who stay. I learned to love that trust. It's softer than a lock. My method was not clever. It was blunt, rehearsed, and low-risk relative to the payoff. I would stop the car at the edge of town, walk up to a porch that was clearly someone's whole life, the photos in the window, the lace curtains, the mail piled just so, and knock. Sometimes I wore a jacket. Sometimes the jacket was dirty and I looked like someone you'd let in because you felt sorry. I told some version of the same story. Car trouble, stranded, my wife pregnant, need to use the phone. If the porch light glowed through the glass, that was enough. People opened doors for that. I never planned to lay a hand on anyone, never. I left my violent impulses for other things, and even then, they were rare. What I wanted was time in their house to find the small things people forget they have. Loose change in jars, the occasional watch stored in a drawer, an envelope with a check. I told myself those things were just unguarded. I rationalized Christmas presents as loose loot, medicine bottles as uncounted, keys as items of convenience. It's easier to be cruel when the harm is abstract, and legal labels bounce in your head like rubber balls. There was a house on the edge of a town I liked. Not a tourist town, not wealthy. Somewhere people still called one another by first names. The grass on the lawn was matted in a way that said the owners moved slow. The porch had a swing that hung crookedly and creaked. The kind of place that smells like stale tea and the things you don't see when you drive by. I remember the door because the woman who answered it was calm in a way that didn't belong with my lies. Her hair was wrapped in a scarf, and she didn't look like someone who'd be startled into a panic. She listened to my story with the same patience you'd give to a fussy child. She said, "Come in, you can use the phone." She said it like she meant it. The house smelled wrong. I don't mean bad in the obvious ways. I mean there was an undersmell, layered and thick, like old bread gone dark at the corners, like metal dipped in something sweet and rotten. You notice things when your life depends on moving quietly. A clock that ticked slower than it should, a floorboard that flexed with a noise like a groan. The radio in the living room was playing a station that sounded like all the voices had been turned down, music without humanity. She called a name when I asked where the phone was. "Hank," she said like a bell. The word landed in the room and filled it. I heard footsteps far heavier than the house should have allowed. Men like Hank don't tiptoe. They walk in a way that tells you the house was built for them to occupy, not just visit. I had an instinct to leave then, to close the door softly and walk away with nothing. But habit kept my feet. Habit and the small arithmetic of risk versus reward. If I could get in and out in a few minutes, I'd be ahead. The woman handed me the receiver, and someone in the kitchen muttered. The phone line was old. I don't remember the conversation. Old fears have a way of erasing details until all that's left is the shape of a thing. When Hank appeared in the doorway, he filled the frame. He was young, his face raw with the kind of youth that doesn't soften into regret. He carried something long and black in his hands. A rifle, or something that looked like one. I didn't have time to be precise. The barrel caught the light and sent it back at me in a bright, accusing line. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't yelling. He simply stood there, a presence like a wall between me and the exit. The woman looked at him and then at me. Her eyes were empty in a way I haven't seen before. I always expected anger, a phone call to the police, a slamming door. Instead, there was a kind of stillness, like the air had been pressed flat. Hank said quietly, "You been around here before?" He asked it without malice, but it was a question that carried a verdict. I lied. Of course I lied. I told a story about getting lost, about the car, about being on my way. In movies, a person like me gets a second to think up the perfect lie. In real life, your head is a bad radio and the signal garbles. I said something dumb. Hank moved closer. He didn't point the thing at me. He didn't have to. He had the look a man gives when he knows numbers and can count advantages. I slipped my hand into my pocket to steady myself and felt the edge of my knife there. Small, folded, a habit for a man who likes options. It was heavy enough to ground me and useless enough to make me realize how ridiculous these little talismans are when confronted with a person who could end you with a breath. I thought about the porch swing, about the quietness. I thought about one night crossing the field with a wallet in my pocket and the face of a woman who had called me please still on my mind. Compassion is strange like that. Sometimes it arrives like guilt. Hank didn't ask many questions. He answered them with glances. He watched my hands, he watched my shoes. He watched the way the light hit my jaw and the way my shoulders hunched. Then he said, "You should go." It wasn't a command so much as a permission without kindness. I left. I don't remember the steps well. The porch felt longer than it should have, like a stage. The door closed behind me with the sound a page makes when you turn it. I walked to my car and tried to make light, tried to laugh with myself, because admitting fear feels like admitting weakness, and weakness adds up. I slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the engine coughed. I cursed under my breath and did what I always did. Kicked the tire, cursed again, told myself to calm down. I faked a breakdown with the same practiced face I used at people's doors. Habit is a cheap actor. The tires were flat. One by one, slowly, they hissed the life away. I say they because that's how you remember it when you tell it later. A small, terrible symmetry. I don't know if Hank or the woman did it. I don't know if it was someone else, if they'd watched me from the yard. All I know is I felt the first judder, and my gut unclenched into a new kind of ruin. I didn't go back, not into the house. I didn't ask for help. I sat for a long time and listened to the radio singing softly inside the house across the lawn. I thought about calling someone, ringing a friend, telling any lie that would get me away. But pride is a stupid shelter, and I kept to my rules. Avoid witnesses, avoid cops, avoid entanglement. I pushed the car off the road and into the shadow of some pines, then I started to walk. The woods there are thin, scrub and pines. Paths animals know better than men. I tucked myself into a hollow where the underbrush swallowed sound. Night came like an old rumor, slow and precise. My palms sweated, my breath leaving frost in the air of my lungs. You discover how much noise a human body makes when you're trying to be invisible. The rustle of fabric, the tick of your fingers against your knees. I convinced myself that if I could wait until dawn, I could change the tire somewhere else or buy one. The truth was uglier. I wanted to feel the night's luxury of being a nobody. Then I heard footsteps. They weren't near at first. They were close enough to remind me of the porch, same heavy tread, same measured pace. And then they were close. I could feel them in the ground, like bass under a cheap speaker. Someone moved through the pines without breaking them. That sound is the herald of every small fear I ever had. I held my breath until my shoulders burned. The footsteps stopped right above me, in the half-light where the trees thinned. Hank stood there, close enough to see breath if I'd turned my head. And he wasn't alone. There were shadows behind him, figures I couldn't name. He looked down at me the way you look at a stray dog, not with hatred, not with mercy, some expression that felt like a balance. "So you shouldn't be out here," he said. The rifle rested against his hip like a wooden thing. He said it like a man naming a fact the way someone else might say, "It's raining." There was no triumph in his voice, no pleasure, just recognition. "You didn't report it?" he asked, and the question made no more sound than the trees themselves. The implication was sharp. Maybe he expected better of me. Maybe he expected law. Maybe he expected I would be more cowardly, or maybe he expected me to be braver. I don't know. The math of my survival has a soft center of shame. My mouth was dry. I thought of running, but the woods are honest and faster than you remember. I had a plan that night, and plans evaporate under someone else's gaze. I extended my hands, slowly, palms up, because showing empty hands is the world's oldest apology. Hank watched my hands like he was reading something. Then, without ceremony, he turned and walked away. The rifle's end vanished through the trees, and the sounds of footsteps withdrew like water down a drain. I lay there until I could feel the blood move normally, and the night forgot me. I walked back to the car at dawn. The tires were shredded in a way that said they hadn't been slashed casually. There were cuts, deep, methodical. Whoever had done it knew the effect of a ruin. I sat in the driver's seat and let the engine die again, knowing I couldn't push further. I drove slowly to the edge of town and then drove until the streets were light, and people looked at me like a man who'd been in a storm. I didn't tell the police, I didn't call anywhere. My pride and my rules kept me from making a report. I told myself, because I had to, for the story to hold together, that I didn't want trouble. I told myself I didn't need to involve anyone. It's a lie that's easy to sell when your hands are still shaking. The thing that lingered wasn't the tires. It was the way the house smelled, the way the woman's voice had an empty softness, the way Hank's silence had been absolute. In the days after, I caught myself trying to explain it away. Maybe they were just wary people. Maybe they'd had trouble before. But a deeper animal part of me felt exposed, like someone had marked the skin between my shoulder blades with a finger. Karma is a concept I mocked in other people's lives. For once it felt like a slow, precise machine. I told myself I learned. I told myself that was the hazard of what I did. But the truth is complicated. Some nights, in a diner late and sipping coffee that tasted like burnt paper, I would imagine Hank pacing the yard with that rifle. I'd imagine the woman standing at the doorway looking at me like I'd failed some test I didn't know I'd been taking. A part of me loved the fear, the way it wrapped my thoughts in a tight, clean coil. Another part hated myself for it. If I'm honest, the memory curdles into something worse when I start to think about who that couple might have been. The house felt older than it should have. There was a look in the woman's eyes like she'd seen too many things and learned to stop naming them. People like that can be kind because kindness is their only defense, or they can be patients of an old, dangerous wisdom. In my darker thoughts, granted I have plenty of those, I wondered if they had been waiting, if they were someone who could step into the dark and not be afraid of it. It's a nasty thought and a selfish one because it tries to subtract responsibility from me. I want to believe that maybe those people were worse than my rule-breaking self because it helps me sleep. I stopped going into those small towns for a while. Not because I suddenly grew a conscience, but because fear has a way of rearranging habits. Fear is a practical thing. It's a finer instructor than conscience when you think about it that way. The night the tires were slashed changed something in me. Not the part that kept committing petty thefts on busy streets. It changed the part that told stories to itself in the dark. Those excuses and rationalizations. They grew thinner after that. People ask after nights like that whether I felt supernatural presence, whether there was something beyond men in the pines. I can't tell you. All I can tell you is the way the laughter didn't fit, the odd pause in the house, the way Hank's voice seemed to name me to the trees, like it was reading a ledger. Maybe it was just a family protecting what they had. Maybe it was something else. I don't know. I don't like having to say that and leave it there. Uncertainty is a worse kind of torment than certainty, because our minds fill gaps with the worst possibilities. I spent months thinking about the tires, not rationally. I pictured hands, patching up the rubber like a surgeon working slow. I pictured the rifle's barrel catching the sun. I pictured the woman's scarf. The more I thought, the less sure I was of anything but the one immutable fact. I left empty-handed. I had a small victory the size of an absence, and it tasted like a lie. A lifetime of small crimes teaches you a vocabulary of guilt and evasion. You decorate your conscience with small, irrelevant facts so it doesn't scream. You say things like, "I never hit anyone," or "I never took sentimental items," as if those absolve you. But the hollow grows regardless. You learn to slide through shadows and avoid names. The house on the edge of that town asked me a question I couldn't answer. What do you do when the people you thought you could take from are not the ones to be taken? In the end, the thing that haunted me most wasn't the possibility of being caught by the law. It was the possibility that someone, two someones in a crooked little house, knew when to stand still and let me walk into a trap. It's such a bruising idea, because it implies intention on their part and incompetence on mine. I resented both. Resentment is heavy and makes you think cleverer thoughts. I didn't go back to any house like that, but I kept doing what I did. Old habits don't fade because of a scare. They get smarter about avoiding the person who scares you. I picked different towns, different porches. I was more careful with the signals people give. I listened to tones and watched the way curtains moved. You learn to read suspicion like it's another language. And still, every now and then, a sound or a smell would split me open. When someone called my name from somewhere I didn't expect, or when headlights cut across a field and I felt observed, I thought of that night. I thought of Hank walking away, and the way the house had absorbed me whole and then spat me out. I never did find out if that couple were just watchful or something more. I never found out who slit my tires. I never found out whether there was a pattern to the oddities of the house. I only had the sensation of having been inspected and judged by a private tribunal, the verdict of which I was permitted to carry in silence. I told myself stories after that, myths that made me feel safer. Maybe they were trying to scare me straight. Maybe they'd seen me at someone else's home. Maybe they were vigilantes, old people who had had enough. Maybe they were nothing special at all. The thing is, questions that can't be answered become rooms you move through with soft steps. You learn not to stand in them. I walked into the small towns differently after that. I kept my head down. I learned to ask for a glass of water rather than the phone. I learned to look for children's toys in yards as evidence people were home. That sounds ridiculous, but my job is full of ridiculous rules. I saw how quickly the universe could flip a script. The night with Hank taught me to expect the unexpected, which is both a skill and a curse. There are nights I look back on and wonder if the couple were doing what criminals sometimes do. They set traps and watch for the thrill. But the thrill of being thrashed by someone else is not comforting. It's humbling. It forces you to recognize that your small kingdom of schemes is brittle. I thought that was the end of the story. I thought the scar would remain private, a dull ache. Then, months after, I found a note slid under my door at a motel I was staying in for a job. It was a single line in a careful, looping hand. "We saw you leave." No signature, no address, just the tremor of being watched made into ink on paper. I didn't answer it. I burned it in the sink until the paper curled black and the smell made me sick. I threw the ashes into the toilet and flushed. You would think an anonymous note would be small. You would think it simple to ignore. But the thing about being on the other side of someone else's attention is it haunts you even when the attention is a stranger. I quit that kind of con not because of the note alone, but because the note sat on top of all the other small things I'd collected, like proof I was still alive in the vagrant sense. I traded that work for other things, easier on the psyche, less invasive. I became a different kind of small-time thief. Still a thief, but the kind that likes anonymity rather than intimacy. It was a compromise. You don't often have a clean break from a life. Every so often I still drive by that town on purpose. Curiosity mixes with a little self-punishment, and I want to see if the porch is empty, if the swing still creaks. It does. The house still lives there like a quiet thing. People pass by, children ride bikes on the street. Life persists in the same old way. Hank would be older now. The woman would have new lines around her mouth. Maybe they died. Maybe they moved. I don't know. Uncertainty is the only constant. That night with Hank taught me a lesson that isn't moral so much as elemental. You can plan everything and still be surprised. The world finds a way to stare back at you. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it aims a rifle. Sometimes it leaves a note. The question that followed me around after that was a small one, always whispering, what happens when the people you think are victims are the ones who strike first? I could sit here and claim the answer is complex, and it is. For me, complexity turned into a small, persistent fear. For a while I slept with a light on and listened for noises at the edge of the room. I bought a car that didn't break down on the side of the road. I changed my routes. I became a man who calculates risks not by the money on the table, but by the chance of being watched. A few months later, something else happened. Something that made me feel watched in a different way. Sound rather than sight. A laugh in a mall at 3 in the morning. Doors that moved by themselves. My name called when no one was there. But that is a different story, and it begins in another job altogether. Story 2, the mall that haunts. You learn to despise the quiet when you guard things. I worked overnight at a mall for a couple years. Security is 90% boredom and 10% adrenaline, if you're lucky. My job was simple on paper. Patrol, watch cameras, log anything that looked like it might cause insurance to grumble. In practice, it becomes a school for finding weak places in people's routines. When the lights dim and the stores stack their shutters like rib bones, the mall turns into a playground of blind spots. At first, I did my job. You get paid to be bored, so you respect the boredom. You check doors, you make sure the janitor isn't sneaking into the boutique, you patrol the parking lot for cars that shouldn't be there. Then curiosity creeps up, like a bad customer who keeps coming back. Curiosity plus boredom is the perfect recipe for mischief. I found blind spots in cameras, angles where the frame missed the corner of a jewelry case, or where a storage door opened without being noticed. For a man who'd spent a long time taking things, those little shadows glued to the camera feed were irresistible. I started small. I moved a couple of pair of sunglasses from their display to my pocket. I took a watch. I told myself it was for the thrill. I told myself I was only taking things that the cameras didn't see. I told myself 100 things that made room for depravity. It escalates quietly. You tell yourself you won't push it. Just a thing here, a thing there. Then someone finds that something missing and the security report becomes a hum in the office, the kind that means someone will question you. I cultivated indifference. I cultivated a face like glass. That made me uncomfortable, and that discomfort energized me. You're never so alive as when you're afraid of getting caught. The first odd night was a laughing sound. It was faint, the kind of human noise that seems to belong to a memory rather than presence. It started down by an old arcade, machines that still ate quarters and coughed them out like mechanical goats. The sound was children's laughter, bright and wrong in the hollow of a closed mall. I clicked through the cameras and saw empty aisles, mannequins posed like meditations. The laugh faded as if someone had switched off a radio. I admit I felt a thrill of triumph. If there were children in the mall at 3 in the morning, that meant an immediate breach in security. Either a family had lost a kid or some trespassers lurked. Either way, there was a story. I told myself the laugh was proof of life, of truth, that the cameras sometimes missed things beyond the edges. But when you start to steal from the place you watch, the things you imagine begin to leak back at you. After a few nights, the laughing returned. It moved from the arcade to the cosmetics aisle to the empty food court. It had no source on any camera. The footage, when I rewound and slowed it, showed nothing but aisles and empty chairs and the occasional bag left in a corner. But the sound was there in my head, as clearly as if someone had pressed a child's voice against my ear. The juxtaposition, vision blank, sound full, began to do something to me. Then I heard my name. It was soft, like someone saying it under their breath in a room full of curtains. It wasn't the loud, angry call of a supervisor. It wasn't the flat syllable of the paging system. It was a name spoken with a knowledge that felt private. "Marcus?" a voice said one night as I walked past the shuttered store with the broken window. I froze. The sound had come from the corridor, not from the cameras. I double-checked the feed. There was no one. I started to get sloppy after that. Guilt has a way of making you careless. You tell yourself the mall is wrong, that it's hiding things from you. You tell yourself it's only fair if it hides things first. So I pushed more. I used back rooms where deliveries came in. I learned to slip past the sensors when the crew closed a store the wrong way. I never hurt anyone. I never went for violence. But theft doesn't have a soft side. It has consequences, even if those consequences are delivered in whispers. One night, while I was at the monitors, the voice called again. This time it wasn't a name exactly. It was a breath that ended in a laugh and something like a word of understanding. I checked the camera in the food court. The feed showed the trash cans, a sliver of the fountain, and a single chair tilted as if someone had just stood up. There was no one there. I walked through the mall, the lights humming like old machinery. I passed the mannequins and listened. The laughter pealed from a corner where the lenses seemed to cross. I crouched and looked into the glass of a storefront window. On the other side of the glass, in the reflection, I saw myself, the security guy, the man who thought he owned the night. I saw my face slacken, my fingers clench. Behind me, in the reflection only, something moved. It was like a smear, an absence shaped like a child. A pair of legs that left no shadow. I turned around and there was nothing. No child, no person, nothing tangible. The laugh came again, close enough that my skin crawled. People hear voices and laugh and call it madness or the wind or rats in the vents. I have slept inside places that are hollow with sound and smelled the pipes and the old food and the steam rising from a restaurant left overnight. There are rational explanations. There are also nights in which rationality shrinks and the mall becomes a place with a will of its own. Maybe it resented being worked into the night. Maybe it took the things I took as insults and offered me something worse. What haunted me wasn't just the laughs. It was that the cameras, the very tools I relied on, showed nothing. Hours of footage where my own figure walked the tiles alone. For a thief, that is an exquisite torture. Evidence that your illusions are single-sided. I could see myself stealing on film, moving goods under a tarp, pocketing items in back rooms. But when I replayed the segments where the noises happened, I was alone on every frame. Nothing in the lens matched the audio. I told the supervisor. I didn't tell him about the thefts. I said the cameras were acting up, that the audio feed recorded phantom sounds and the logs had gaps. He grunted and sent a tech. They replaced a tape deck and called it a day, but the fix didn't make the laughter go away. The nights became layered. My petty thefts continued, and alongside them bloomed an uncanny theater where I was the only actor who could not see the audience. There were nights when the voice knew things about me. It mentioned my mother once, an innocuous detail, the name of a woman who rarely entered the wires of my life. I felt cold at that. How could the place know? I tried to make sense of it with logical things. Maybe an old janitor had heard me talk into my phone. Maybe someone had stalked me. But the voice's inflection wasn't human sometimes. It had a cadence like a parent reading a bedtime story, gentle but edged with a knowledge that cut. The more I tried to capture it, the more the mall mocked me. I wired recorders into aisles, left my body in the frame, and waited. At the moment the sound came, my devices showed nothing. The existing footage had gaps where it should have been full. It's like watching someone erase things in real time and pretend they never existed. That alone would annoy a man with my habits, but it did worse. It made me feel seen and invisible at once. The worst part of being a thief is that you become Quicksilver. The worst part of being haunted is that Quicksilver runs toward reflection and finds nothing. A supervisor began to whisper about inventory losses. The corporate office sent memos with polite threats about cameras and liabilities. My thefts were small, less than the threshold that usually prompts arrests, so they looked first at employees. Someone in an office with fluorescent lights sees payroll and sees an easy scapegoat. I felt the noose tighten, not because of evidence, but because suspicion tends to seek the nearest shadow. Fear has different shapes. In the woods it looks like footsteps in the brush. In the mall it looks like a camera that won't show who laughed. In my chest it felt like hands around my throat that I could not name. I stopped sleeping as well. I played the footage on a loop like some tired music. I saw myself do things I told myself were necessary and justified, and, in the margins, nothing that could explain the laughter. One night, the voice said my name while I was on the floor inspecting a back door. It said it in a tone that told me it had been watching my mistakes, counting them, adding them up. "You like the dark," it said, like someone correcting a child. I answered, because I wanted to prove I wasn't afraid, though I had been afraid for a few nights now. I answered softly, "Who's there?" My voice sounded thinner than it should have. The space hummed. The cameras continued to show empty frames. For a while, paranoia and guilt wove their ropes together, and I began to imagine the laugh as punishment. It was as if the mall itself had a memory, and it decided to remind me what I'd stolen. It knew the smell of my palms, and the way I rubbed the back of my neck after a risky move. It knew the types of pockets I favored, or at least that was how my mind built a story to keep its edges from fraying. I found notes once, tiny things tucked into the corners of the maintenance room, post-it scraps with a child's scrawl that said, "Stop taking." No signature, no place to point blame. That note made me furious and genuinely scared at the same time. Someone had broken the rules. Someone had stepped into my play. Whoever it was knew where I moved and how I moved. The note could have belonged to a bored teenager, which is a reasonable thing to fear, or it could belong to whatever commanded the laughter, which is less comforting. When the supervisor's voice started to lean, when the company sent a security auditor to comb through the footage, I stopped going to the monitors. The place where I used to take pleasure in finding shadows began to feel like a theater, waiting for the curtain to drop. I thought about leaving, but leaving is an admission. Leaving is a confession written in steps. The night it nearly got physical, I was following a service corridor between the food court and a shuttered bookstore. The air smelled of spilled coffee and the sourness left by a vending machine's last coin. Something moved at the end of the corridor, a figure that bent and turned the wrong way. I froze because a body in a service corridor at 3 in the morning should have an explanation like a janitor or a lost teenager. I stepped forward, and the figure turned. It was a kid, maybe 12, with hollow eyes and a smile that should have been empty. He wore an old sports hoodie, but the fabric looked like it had seen too many washes. He didn't run when I moved. He didn't seem surprised to find me. He tilted his head and said, "You shouldn't do that." The voice was not quite the same as the one on the monitors. It was close enough to my name to feel personal. The kid reached out, and for a moment I thought someone had finally decided to confront me for my thefts. Instead of a shouting match or a call to management, the kid did something that tasted like a threat wrapped in kindness. He pointed to the cameras above the corridor with a small, precise gesture, and then tapped his chest where a name tag might be. There was no name tag. He looked at me the way people look at an animal that doesn't belong in their yard. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the black mouth of the bookstore like a shadow swallowed. I stood there with my legs loose and breath tight. Management could have shown up. The kid could have called the police. But none of that happened. The only thing that lingered was the smell of old pages, as if the bookstore itself had exhaled. I started to dream about being called by names I hadn't heard in years. I dreamed of hands leaving tokens in my locker, pieces of paper with jokes, childish little things that meant someone was watching me like a game. The auditors increased their presence. The jokes stopped. The laughter continued, but in a different register, now layered with a mocking patience. It was like being lectured by a chorus of children who know the rules of a game better than you do. I quit before they could fire me. Not out of guilt so much as the sense that the place had decided I wasn't the only one who could play its games. I walked out with the rest of my clothes in a bag and the taste of metal in my mouth, like a battery about to die. I told myself I'd had enough, that the risk wasn't worth it. I told myself other things, too. I told myself I would never go back. But you don't quit ghosts that easily. The laughter followed me. Once, in a gas station parking lot, I swore I heard 2 notes of it in the hum of a distant highway, like a child's giggle carried out into the open. I turned around, heart thudding, and a little boy riding his bike beamed at me. His mouth was full of a gap-toothed smile. He shouted, "Hey, mister!" And the word that hung after it sounded like the echo of something that missed me by inches. "Marcus." I walked away. I tried to make sense of it through law and reason. Maybe the mall had a history of stray children who'd once played there overnight. Maybe a family had lost a son. Maybe someone with a morbid sense of humor knew my name and wanted to scare me away. Those are plausible. They are also tidy. The truth resists being neat. Part of me knew that. It was never violent there, not physically. The terror was a softer kind that lived inside the skull and made you doubt the world. The worst part wasn't the possibility of being caught. It was the slow, insidious thing, the sense that whatever watched me didn't need evidence to affect me. It could whisper and be believed. It could leave a laugh in the empty air and make the cameras lie. That was the part that ate me. Not getting caught by a cop. I could imagine cops and beat trials and bargaining. But to be unmoored from the rules of cause and effect, to have a place answer you as if it had memory and teeth, that was a different kind of fear. So I left. I told myself I was done because the heat in the building was getting bad, because the budget cuts meant fewer late-night shifts, because a new job would be cleaner. The truth is uglier. I left because my nights stopped being mine. When a place you've learned to cheat on starts reminding you of things you thought buried, you stop wanting to be inside it. The mall kept its secrets. I kept mine. They never reconciled. There are small residues that never quite wash away. Months later, at a grocery store, someone on an overhead speaker made a joke about lost children, and their call echoed like a chime in my head. A little girl in the produce section laughed the exact same way the mall had laughed. My first reaction was reflexive. Turn, check windows, look for cameras, and then a dull resignation. The world has a tendency to replay motifs. You try to outrun them and only succeed in learning their rhythms. I told myself the laugh had been a warning. I told myself the notes had been pranks. I told myself a bored kid could be cruel in a mall more than clever. But when you are the kind of person who takes things knowing you can hide it, being on the receiving end of something unseen is a shock to the system. It's a reversal you don't have a script for. You were trained to be the spectator. Suddenly, you're being watched. The cameras never caught whatever laughed. The monitors never showed hands leaving notes. The footage showed only my own face, a man moving between aisles, making time into money. The rest, the sound, the feeling, the child's shadow, lived only in places the lenses refused to name. It's a hard thing to explain to someone who hasn't felt their own name reach them in a place it shouldn't. The only thing that fits is this sentence. I left, and the thing that haunted me followed in small, almost courteous ways. It didn't need to touch me to make me jump. The cameras showed nothing. But I heard my own name called. Story 3, The College Stalker. It's easy to romanticize obsession when you tell yourself it's love. That's the trick. You flatten a person into an idea until their complexity won't inconvenience your hunger. College gave me a million tiny permissions to believe myself different. People forgive eccentricity on a campus because the whole place acts out a rehearsal of adult life. I wasn't lonely in the grand, tragic sense. I was isolated by choices, bad ones, sloppy ones, and I found a woman who became a shape I could fit my loneliness into. Her name was Emily. She laughed like someone who saved energy for the right moments. She had small rituals, a black coffee at a certain coffee bar, a stack of sticky notes on the corner of her laptop, a habit of tucking a stray hair behind her ear when she concentrated. I noticed those things in a way that felt predatory. Not at first. At first it was study sessions, the kind of accidental pairings that professors make when they want collaboration and don't care whose awkwardness collides. I told myself I was just being friendly. I told myself I was helping. Those were the lies that gave me permission to trespass. I learned her schedule without meaning to. I saw what books she borrowed. I watched her posts, public scraps of life, and I filed them into a small archive in my head. It started with a phone number she gave me for a group project, then a photo that stuck in my phone because I'd get nervous before class and look at it like it was armor. Obsession is not dramatic in the beginning. It's small, like adding sugar to a cup until you can't taste anything but sweetness. You start to drive by another's apartment to see if they're okay. You create reasons to be near them that sound sensible when you say them out loud. You send a text that says, "Hey, did you get that email?" And when there's no reply, you imagine replies that would fix the silence. You tell yourself your interest is harmless because you don't touch anything. The internet makes that reasoning easy. Anonymous windows, a flurry of likes, GPS breadcrumbs that feel like ownership. It's less dangerous than the schemes I did before, and that makes it feel safer. I told myself she didn't notice much. That was arrogance. She noticed. She noticed the extra shadow that lingered at the edge of her feed. She noticed the car that loomed for 5 minutes at the corner of a block and then drove away. People who live their lives in the open see small intruders better than loners convinced of their invisibility. She said one thing once in a group, something offhand like, "Some boys can be creepy," and the phrase lodged like a stone in a shoe. I can tell you now. I've spent years trying to pretend I didn't feel that jab of recognition. When the line between watching and acting blurred, I started leaving harmless things. A coffee cup on the sidewalk near her building, a book left on a bench with a note inside. I thought it was a way to be seen without confronting, I convinced myself of 1,000 niceties, that I was being poetic, that I was making a gesture. But gestures have ownership, and ownership slides quickly into entitlement. The cup became a breadcrumb in a small dangerous trail toward my own justification. Then the harassment started the other way. It was small at first. Someone knocked my window at night. A shadow pressed against the porch and left a scrape on my mailbox. My tires were dented once, an act that made me angry as much as afraid. The escalation was enough to unnerve me, a man who had made his life on the principle of staying out of reach. Whoever was on the other side of these acts had learned to name the rhythms I liked to hide in. Then came the nights when someone rang my doorbell at 3 a.m. I lived alone in a cheap little apartment with thin walls and thinner patience. At first I ignored it. People ring bells by accident. Then it happened again and again. Once, when I peered through the peephole, I thought I saw a figure standing under the sodium streetlight. Just a shape, no face, like a silhouette on a bad screen. Another night I opened the door to nothing but a single shoe on the doormat, clean and new like a marker. I did not want to trouble my parents with any of this. I'd learned a taste for independence, for not being the boy who called his mother about small fears. But one night, after a series of knocks that left my nerves raw, and after a silhouette at the window that made my chest hollow, I packed a bag and went home. I told myself I wasn't running. I told myself I'd been practical. My father made a joke about parking in front of my building, like an old man with an empty toolbox. My mother brewed coffee as if nothing had been strange in me at all. The things stopped after I left, or at least they stopped in the direct places where I lived. Messages didn't arrive. The night visits ceased. I told myself a neighbor had tired of the game, or that the person behind the knocks had chosen easier prey. I told myself 100 neat things to keep the shame from sticking. But some nights, lying in my childhood bed, I imagined a shadow standing at my old window, peering at the house that had taught me to be small. The idea of being the object of someone else's gaze, power reclaimed and turned on me, stung with humiliation more than with fear. I hadn't just been watched. I'd been put in someone else's mythology. I never learned who harassed me. I never found a person to point at and accuse. That lack of closure was part of the punishment. People who like to control situations hate unknowns. The unknown is a mirror that reflects your worst self. For weeks, I rehearsed confrontations and apologies I never made. I thought about telling Emily, but to do so would be to confess the original trespasses that had set this whole thing into motion. Pride makes you keep your crimes as private as trophies. There is a particular cruelty when you become the subject of the behavior you once inflicted. It teaches a blunt lesson. The person on the other end of your obsession isn't an object. They're a human who can respond in ways you didn't expect. Sometimes that response is legitimate fear. Sometimes it's retaliation. Sometimes it's a neighbor with a grudge or a stranger with a sense of justice. Whatever the cause, the effect on me was the same. Shame replaced arrogance. I withdrew from the life that had allowed me to craft a shadow self, and for a while I lived with the quiet knowledge that I had created my own undoing. The worst nights were the ones where I imagined her voice in the darkness, not accusing, not even angry, just a tired comment about the men who can't read the signs. I'd lie awake and ask myself if she had said creepy in the room describing me, whether her warning had been aimed at people like me. The phrase would ricochet in my head. She said some boys were creepy. Was she talking about me? I didn't return to class that semester. I changed my routine, my routes, my reasons for being in places. I learned a new humility that hurt more than any punishment the legal world could have given me. Being stalked by a ghost of your own, making forces an intimacy with your worst traits. You learn what it feels like to be on the other side, and you don't like the view. When I'm honest, the thing I remember best is not a specific night, but the slow, staining realization that someone else's fear could be as real as the thing I once thought I could control. I did not deserve sympathy in that moment. I did not expect it. But the experience reframed pieces of me in ways no arrest ever could. Shame is a teacher with no kindness, and I sat in her class for a long time. She disappeared from my life like some people do, quietly by absence. I never confronted her, I never asked what she'd seen. The story closed itself in an open way that never satisfied curiosity or repentance. You carry an ache like that for a long time, It teaches you to respect other people's boundaries because you know how it feels to be their target. She taught me one thing beyond shame. The world can flip you with a single knock. I had knocked on doors for reasons that were sometimes base and sometimes bored. Now the knock came to me, and the sensation of being on the receiving end was a cold, corrective thing. Story 4. Reverse thief turned target. There is a subset of people who break into empty places for reasons that have nothing to do with money. We call it by different names: joyriding, thrill-seeking, trespassing. For me, it was the first pure rush again, the private knowledge of being somewhere you shouldn't be. At first, I went into vacant houses to see how they felt. I watched the way dust lay on mantels and how light moved across an unmade bed. It felt intimate in a way that a wallet in a pocket never could. Reverse theft began as a joke. I left things in return, small odd items tucked onto a pillow or balanced on a kitchen counter, a coin in a sugar jar, a button in a cereal box. The idea was perverse. I'd give back a weird little token and then watch to see how the occupant reacted. Sometimes they laughed and left a note in the door. Sometimes they called the police, and I would watch the lights wash down the street from a safe distance. It was a game of shadows, and I was very good at shadows. But games have rules, and someone else reads the rulebook differently. What started as a dare to myself became a challenge to whoever lived in those houses. How long before they noticed? How would they respond? I like to believe that leaving something was a non-violent test of attention. That arrogance is the same taste in my mouth from other sections of my life. The pretense of harmlessness is a mask. Then the tokens changed. The first time I found a note slipped under my own door, it was jaunty, like a child's scribble. Stop. My laugh at that time was brittle. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe a cop, maybe someone who'd had enough. I burned the note in the sink and told myself I had imagined it. That decision emboldened whoever was on the other side. The next things were weirder. A bouquet of flowers left on my stoop with a single yellow bloom at its center. A dead sparrow placed on my porch in a small, careful bundle. A hair tie left on my dashboard. The tokens were not all menacing at first. Some were bizarrely intimate, like a person trying to get inside my head by mimicking small domestic gestures. The dead bird felt different. It's a clean, immediate shock you don't easily explain. Whoever left it wanted me to know they'd been in my home, or at least by it. I began to hear things, a tapping in the vents at night, like fingers dancing across metal. A soft, whispered sound through the wall that made the hair on my arms stand up. My rational mind invented explanations, settling pipes, rodents, kids playing. But the right part of fear is comparative. I had been a person who invaded privacy for pleasure. I knew what an invasion felt like. That knowledge made the sounds intolerable. Once I came home and found my door unlocked, the hinges had been nudged inwards with a patience that suggested practice. Inside, someone had placed a single yellow flower on my kitchen counter, just the stem, no water. Across the street, an older couple sat on their porch with 2 mugs and the morning light in their hands. The woman had a similarly yellow bloom pinned to her dress. The match was too specific to be a coincidence. I sat in my car and watched them sip and watch the street like people who had met their amusement for the day. I drove away and didn't return. It is a strange thing to leave your own residence, not because of a force that physically drives you out, but because the space's ownership is contested in a way your mind cannot abide. You move because your courage to stay in a place you once controlled has evaporated. I moved into a cheap apartment with a landlord who didn't ask questions. For a while, I convinced myself I'd outsmarted whoever had been leaving tokens. I carried my keys and watched the windows across from my building like a man expecting flashes in the dark. Paranoia, when it becomes a habit, creates its own architecture. You start to design your life around assumed threats. Then one night I found a dead bird on my counter and a note tucked under it. "We know it was you." The handwriting was careful, almost polite. There was no signature, no offer to negotiate. Just the assertion, the knowledge. The sight of the bird, small and feathered and cold, made something in my chest hard and raw. It wasn't the bird that terrified me so much as the fact that someone knew. They had watched me. and they had selected a language I could not comfortably interpret. I saw them after that. Across the street, standing at the end of a block, an older couple with a posture of ordinary people who keep ordinary watch. He blew smoke slowly and did not flinch when I noticed. She pinched the stem of a yellow flower between two fingers and turned it, as if she liked the weight. They were too normal to be caricatures, and that normalcy made them more frightening. Normal people who do unusual things have an advantage because you never expect the ordinary to be the author of your fear. I installed door chains that were thin and a joke against a determined person. I avoided alley shortcuts. I changed my answer machines. None of it helped the way you think defenses help. Paranoia does not respond to locks. It responds to the illusion of agency. Someone was in my life who had moved from occupant to critic. They left messages in ways that made me question my entire career of messing with people's private spaces. It's a tidy, mean sort of justice. The final straw was when I came back one evening to find the vents in my apartment tinkered with. Metal slightly ajar where it shouldn't be. The sound that came through then was not wind, but a low, attentive murmur. It felt like breath near the back of my head. I considered calling someone, but who? The police would ask questions and then ask for reasons. Admitting I broke into houses to leave odd gifts is not a good way to get sympathy. I sold the furniture I could quietly and left in the dark with a duffel over my shoulder. That night I drove until the streetlights thinned and the radio were only static. I thought about the reverse of what I'd done, the people whose jars I'd rifled through, the photographs I'd touched to make sure they were real. I thought about the older couple across the street and their matching flowers and wondered about the life that might have trained them to notice small aberrations. The thing that terrifies someone like me is not physical violence. It's to be named and then shown evidence of being known. A weeks-long move became a life change. I stopped what I called reverse thievery. The ritual was too intimate for the price, and the price had been paid in small horrors rather than police reports. I quit not because I suddenly embraced morality, but because the cost of being watched in a way that undermined my illusions was too high. You become a different person when the world decides to answer you. Then I found another note at a motel, a month after moving to another state. It lay on the pillow, neat and small. We keep our flowers. No more threats. No further harassment, at least none that I could prove. The message landed like a finalizer on a chapter. Someone wanted me to know their watchfulness continued even if distance separated us. I left spaces with respect after that, not because I'd grown a conscience, but because the thrill had been recoded into an unpleasant memory. There is a difference between fear that sharpens you and fear that flattens you. This was the latter. It didn't teach me to be better. It trained me to be quieter. Then I found a dead bird on my counter with a note. Conclusion: 4 nights. 4 different kinds of wrong. Different jobs, different faces. A mixture of bravado and regret that I can still taste. If you ask me if any of those things were supernatural, if the mall laughed because the building had a soul, if Hank and his house were some private tribunal, if the older couple across the street had powers, I will tell you I don't know. That answer feels inadequate because humans are greedy for closure. We prefer a cause that sits in a box we can inspect. But my experiences live in a place between cause and conscience. They could be people watching back with a precise hunger for justice. They could be pranksters with an elaborate sense of moral rectitude. They could be my own mind catching up to me in ways that terrify. What I learned is not tidy. The lessons are small and granular. You cannot assume victims are always powerless. You cannot assume your wrongdoing will meet only with the law, and you cannot assume that the reverse of your actions will be painless. Sometimes the world answers you by turning the rules around and making you the subject of the very vulnerability you created in others. I changed some habits. I stopped certain kinds of work. I stopped leaning on the arrogance that made me believe I'd always be the watcher, never the watched. I still sleep with the light sometimes. I keep a phone on, though I avoid checking it for hours, because an unknown message is a pressure I don't need. I don't pretend I've been absolved. The small reforms are pragmatic as much as remorseful. They keep me out of places that might be tempting, and them out of my life. Do I believe in karma? Partly. The idea that the universe has a ledger is a comforting if limited story. Do I believe in ghosts? I can't say, because so much of what I experienced could be explained by human attention and the occasional cruel prank. The ambiguity is its own punishment. You spend nights wondering whether someone else has more power than you, or whether your own conscience is louder than you've ever let on. If there's a moral here, it's only that actions echo in ways you might not expect. You can take without immediate consequence for a long time, and then find your debts paid in strange currency. Slashed tires, laughter in empty corridors, a shoe on your step, a dead bird on your counter. Those things force you to look at the ledger. They do not absolve you, nor do they give you the peace of clarity. They only leave you with the slow, grinding business of living under the possibility of being seen. I'm not a good person. I say that again because it is the setting for everything else. Confessions, small reforms, the lingering questions. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I don't excuse myself into sainthood. I do offer this. If you find your life mirrored back at you in ugly ways, consider the possibility you helped write those reflections. And if you are someone who has been on the receiving end of what I once did, know this much. I understand the humiliation better than I used to. That understanding doesn't fix things. It just sits heavy in you like a new unwelcome knowledge. If any of these stories got under your skin, tell me which one in the comments. Hit like if you could stomach it. Share with someone who likes dark, true tales, and, if you haven't yet, subscribe for more confessions from people who crossed lines and lived to tell a lot of unfinished stories.